here are criticisms, and here's what we need to do. We need to say that there are people who are criticizing Dan, and possibly the most important is Dr. David King. And here is his study that he did called the Petra fallacy. It came out in 2018, 2 years ago. It's a good 54 pages long. If you have a chance, do read it. I've gone through it, and Al-Fadi and I did a whole set of programs on it, confronting it and coming to conclusions on it. And that's what I'm going to introduce to you today, because we need to look and see what the criticisms are of Dan, because we need to see both sides of the equation. We need to understand why is it that people are criticizing Dan, but we also need to make sure that we come up with reference, and we also come up with support and responses to these criticisms. Let's go ahead and let's start, and let's introduce these two individuals. On the left, you see Dr. David King. He has been a lecturer in Edinburgh and also in Germany. He is considered to be the world authority on the Qibla, and that's why it's important that we listen to him. Since he has done the most work on the Qibla than anybody else until Dan, he is a worthy critic of Dan, and that's why when he wrote his paper in 2018, he was quite incensed with Gibson, and you'll see that. And if you read it, you'll see it just in the first page. The tone of it is very angry. He's very upset with what Gibson has found, and you can see why as we go through it. But let's look at this debate. Let's look at see what King is coming up with, and let's start with his defining terms. He defines 4 different eras. He calls pre-Islam anything up until 549. And then he calls early Islam from 550 to 799. So that would be just before Muhammad was born in 570, up until the 799, the end of the 8th century. And then he moves into what he calls medieval Islam, and that's from the 800s to the 9th century up until the 1300s. That's the 14th century. And then he refers to modern Islam as 1300 up until today. Those are his defining terms. So let's use those terms and let's go with what he says. I'm not sure I agree with them, but nonetheless, since he categorizes them, we'll use his categories for our talk today. Now, let's start with their presuppositions. Both King and Gibson agreed that the Qiblas in the earliest 200 years after Muhammad go in all kinds of directions. There's nobody can dispute that. And so they both start from that agreement. King, however, assumes that the 9th through 12th century Muslim scholars, the medieval scholars, who were mathematicians, that their mathematical viewpoints and theories are the correct ones, suggesting that the earlier myriad of Qibla's directions were due to not knowing mathematics, that they were just ignorant. The earlier Arabs were just simply ignorant, and so they use other varied reasons for their directions, and that's why we find a multiplicity of different directions of the Qibla. Gibson assumes that these medieval scholars from the 9th and 12th century are much too late. And so instead, he goes back to the 7th and 8th century, to the time that these mosques were being built, to the time that the Qiblas were being formed, and measures the Qibla on the ground. So he goes to each one of these mosques personally and measures them, and then comes up with other theories to explain them. Now, of course, you know what they are, that the Qiblas follow not a multiplicity of directions, a variety of directions, but really only 4 directions. And they are all understood once you look and see what's happening politically on the ground. If you follow the politics, you can follow why the 4 Qiblas were created and maintained. Now, these 4 directions you can see here, I've done this already. You have about 17 of them that are up till 706 only facing Petra. There was a confusion for the next 100 years. Then the 20 that face in between, followed by the 10 that face Mecca and the 6 that are parallel. Yet the Qibla was then not finalized towards Mecca until 876, which is 250 years, much too late. Here's that first one. This is a kind of review what we just did, but I wanted just to make some notes on that. There are no Qiblas which are directed in any other direction than Petra up to 706. And these earliest mosques were probably previously Nabatean temples. This comes up a lot of times. People ask me, how can you have Qiblas that exist while Muhammad was still living, such as 624 and 632? Well, these are Nabatean temples. That's why. These were the Nabateans who their temples were always facing their ancestral temples, and they were facing, therefore, the sanctuary. So they were facing the sanctuary of their people, of their ancestors. That's why they were all facing Petra. They then became mosque as Islam then took them over and then renamed them. But mosque could be in any language, I'm sorry, in any culture. A mosque is a place where you bow, a place of bowing. And that's why those original floor plans, that's why it's so important you go to the ruins, and that's why it's so important that you then measure those qiblas. Since the Nabateans were traders who were famous for being able to cross the trackless deserts on camels, they never had their own empire. So Petra took on an even added importance as their sanctuary, littered with tombs and temples. Here, I'm looking for the word, and it's right there on the page. The second qibla between, let's ask some notes on that. The first of these between mosques was built after the Second Civil War in 706, and it was known as the Wasit Mosque, which might, if you know anything about Arabic, Wasit means between. So it was named for what it was doing. It was named because it was between these two cities. That should be quite evident. It was built in Iraq by Al-Hajjaj, who is the governor over there in Kufa, the governor of Iraq under Abd al-Malik, after killing Ibn Zubair in Hijaz. That's the reason he turned away from Mecca. 20 more mosques were built using this between direction of Qibla, all under the authority of Al-Hajjaj. And they were continued to be built until Hajjaj died. Once he died, there was no reason now to build these mosques in that direction, and they were then redirected back to Mecca. Al-Kinani al-Basri in 776 to 868 mentioned that the between qiblas tarnished the reputation of the Caliph al-Wali, the son of Abd al-Malik, who allowed them. So you can see that this is well known. This is in their traditions. They called them the between the mosques. So this is not something that Gibson has made up off the top of his head. He's actually referring to not only what the traditions say, but also the historical context of that day. Now, the Meccan mosque only began to appear in 727. That's over 100 years too late. Muhammad ibn Abd al-Azraqi in 837, author of the Kitab Akhbar al-Makkah that I referred to earlier, which reports about Mecca. The earliest of 17 manuscripts are from the 12th century, gives dimensions for the walls of the Kaaba, which fit Petra perfectly, but not Mecca. Archaeologists in Mecca still today have not found a thing of note except an old Ottoman fort, suggesting that there simply is no history to Mecca. And listen, if this is the oldest city's history in the history of mankind, if this is where Adam and Eve were sent to, if this is where Abraham lived in 1900 BC, when they started building all those huge towers, the fourth highest building in the world is built right there at the Kaaba with that huge clock around it, 45 feet across. That clock tower, you have to, when you build it that high, you have to have huge foundations. And when you dig foundations, you go with the builders, the archaeologists come licking their lips because they know there are going to be all kinds of artifacts that are going to be dug up from the foundations. They haven't found a thing. Not one thing. Suggesting to me and to everybody else that there is no history there at Mecca. Surprise, surprise. We're not surprised at all. Now, the fourth Qibla, the parallel Qibla, when we look at the notes and around that, we notice that King says that these are nothing more than solstitial lines. Gibson does not answer this, but considers they are for political reasons. He notes that these different Qiblas bothered the medieval scholars, and they therefore suggested many theories. And they talked about the fact that they're following stars or the sun or the equinox or building walls or solstice lines. Whereas even facing the walls of the Kaaba or the quadrants of the Kaaba, etc., etc. They try to find out every type of excuse as to why these qiblas were facing many different directions. Now, it is these varied ideas that Dr. King accepts. He just accepts wholesale the medieval scholars who are writing the 9th and 10th century. Very few people today accept these theories because they just are that, nothing more than theories. There's nothing that they are looking at that they can support it other than that. I think this is what they're doing. I think it's going this way. I think it's going that way. Therefore, they are suspect. And that's why Gibson's four qiblas match the historical account so much better and therefore are more readily acceptable. Now, let's go into their methodologies. How did they come to their conclusions? King only studied around 5 to 6 mosques. And remember, this is the world authority on the Qibla, and he only studied 5 to 6 mosques. He only physically went to one mosque. He only went to one of them. His whole career based on the Qibla, and he only went to one mosque, the Samarkand Mosque, which is in Tashkent in Uzbekistan. Most of what he knew, therefore, he got from books. He got from other people's writings, specifically the 9th, 10th, and 11th century medieval scholars. Gibson, on the other hand, went to every mosque physically, went to all of them personally, and measured their qiblas using modern techniques. He used the advanced thermal emission and reflection radiometer, the Aster satellites, which are the most exacting, sophisticated satellites that's used for measurements today. King, rather than quoting 7th to 8th century writers, which he should have done because they were writing at the time these mosques were being built, simply quoted later 9th to 11th century medieval Islamic scholars concerning their theories regarding why the earlier Qiblas were so ulta-pulta, as we say in Hindi. He loved to use al-Bazdawi, who lived from 1030 to 1100 up to the 12th century, because he wrote a paper on him in 1983. Yet look at the dates, much too late, and all of his ideas are nothing more than theories or guesses. He only trusted them because they were closer to the time than we are. Can you see the problem there? No, they aren't. They may be closer than we are, but they're not closer to the material that Dan Gibson went to. King's assumption assumed that the variety of Qibla directions were due to the inability of the ancient Arabs to find accurate Qibla directions because they didn't know mathematics and thus were simplistic and inaccurate. He forgot just how adept the ancient Nabateans were in crossing the great trackless deserts using the stars to guide them. He also assumed that the later Meccan Qiblas were much more accurate and thus believed that they knew better than the earlier Muslims how to direct Qiblas. But this is not necessarily true. Note, we already looked at this. The most inaccurate Qiblas were actually the Meccan Qiblas. The most accurate were the between Qiblas, followed by the Petrafied Qiblas, followed by the parallel Qiblas, and then followed by the Meccan Qiblas. So that theory you can throw out the window. The mathematics did not help them. Now, why is it that the earlier ones were so much better? There's a good reason why they were so much more accurate. King thought that the other medieval modern Muslim scholars had assumed that their earlier Arabs didn't have adequate mathematical skills. That's why they did not know where the accuracy of their Qiblas. Yet what really happened was the Arabs lost their ability to find directions accurately because Roman roads were introduced, which they used, and thus did not need to use stars to guide them anymore. Instead, they employed mathematical equations, which turned out to be less accurate. Thus, the ability to detect very accurate measurements was lost. Gibson goes back to the earliest Arabs who built the earliest mosques and found out that they used astronomy, which is the study of stars, to find one's direction, not astrology, which is not the study of stars, but that is to find the future. And they had to because of their trips across so much desert, where the sands shifted and moved. There were no roads there. There weren't even mountains there. You had sand dunes. And with every storm, those dunes shifted and changed. Therefore, if they did not know where they were going, they would die because they would not know where the next oasis was, where the next well was. It was out of sheer survival that they used the stars. How did they do it? Well, to go north and south, he found out that they used something as simple as the North Star. And what they would do is take a kamala, it was a block of wood, like you see on the right there, with a string going through it with knots on it. And they would use it and put it up to the star, and they would pull the string away until the North Star was at the top of the block and the horizon was at the bottom of the block. Once they were there at that point, they looked and saw how many knots there were, and they knew exactly every one of those knots was how many steps, how many thousands or tens of thousands of steps in that particular direction. And that's how they could go north and south quite easily. In order to get their destination correct, they needed to use a constant. That's why they used the Kabul. And then they would use a number of steps a man would walk to arrive at the place they were going. They traveled on foot those days with camels, which were used for carrying goods. Yet because of the fact there were tens of thousands of steps, they could easily get 1 step or 2 steps or even 10 steps. They could forget numbers. That's the problem with counting thousands of steps. So they employed poetry, which had a rhythm, and allotted a number of steps for each poem. Even today, the Arabs are still doing that. You look and you see them, they're still reciting poetry. That's why they were so good at memorization, because they had to memorize these long pieces of poetry. When they came to the end of their poem, they would know how far they had reached and simply added up the number of times they recited a certain poem. That's the reason they chanted poetry as they walked, and they still do that today. If they wanted to go east and west, they had 32 stars which were used on a compass to know when they needed to go east or west from their location in relation to the North Star. Thus, for instance, they would walk towards, let's put this one up here, Al-Naka. That's so many tens of thousands of steps. This is a star in a northwestern direction, which they went for a certain number of strides. In this case, this particular poem that they recited, let's say 16 times. Once they got to Naka, they then turned towards this star, Altir, which is in the eastern direction. And they knew what poetry to go to Altir, and they would have that poetry that they would then recite as they walked until they got to that position. And that's how they found north, south, east, and west. What's fascinating, King has not ever even mentioned that in any of his writings. He didn't even know about that because he didn't go back to the 7th and 6th and the 5th century to find out how the Arabs, the only ones to get across these deserts, remember, they were the only ones that were trading from the Mediterranean world all the way over into China, all the way over into India. They were the only ones able to cross the deserts because they used the stars, proving that they knew their directions more accurately than the later Arabs who used only mathematics. Now, here's King's theories. He had 7 theories that he saw wrong with Dan Gibson. Built on the authority of the prophet or his companions, he said was the first reason that they got Qiblas wrong. He didn't explain this one very well, but he said he did, nor did he source where he got his idea from, though he was probably his friends, the 9th and 11th century medieval scholars. And that's the reason they said, well, they just didn't know. They just used the prophet for their authority and his companions, and therefore they didn't know really how to find these Qibla. Gibbon answers that and says, we don't know of any writings prior to the 9th century which refer to this theory. Shouldn't we therefore just use that which we already know from the 7th and 8th century? Theory number 2, as to why they got these Qiblas wrong, well, they were built on foundations of or in line with pre-Islamic religious architecture, which were cardinally aligned. King therefore concluded Roman buildings or Byzantine buildings. Gibson said no, they only built over top of these buildings because they could then use the rubble of these buildings and stones from these buildings, and because they were centrally located. They were always built in the big center of the city. That's why they built over top, but they did not use those lines or those architectural, the architectural walls on them for what, as you can see, why a little later. They usually built in completely new directions, almost always towards Petra up until 706, and then to other directions, depending on the political exigency of that time. Theory number 3, according to King, they built according to the street plans of pre-Islamic cities. And the example that he gives is this Mosque of Cordoba, which follows the street plans. Gibson notes that the Umayyad Mosque in Jeddah, on the right, that you can see pictured there, it sits askew of the city plans. So it didn't work for Jeddah. Maybe it did for Cordoba, but it did for Jeddah. And then he said, look at the other 100 mosques, over 100 mosques. None of those mosques were following street plans, only the one in Cordoba. And he said possibly a few more. But of that, almost all the mosques are following what another plan, nothing to do with street plans. So the 4th theory that King came up with was that they were built towards the winter sunrise or sunset, or towards some other astronomical horizon phenomenon, and he calls the word sacred geography. And this is his quote. The Muslims developed a sacred geography in which over the centuries various schemes were developed in which segments of the perimeter of the Kaaba corresponded to sectors of the world which had the same Qibla, defined in terms of astronomical risings and settings. The first such schemes appeared in Baghdad in the 9th century. Gibson has problems with this. He came to the conclusion on the astronomical alignments by looking at only 3 cities, the cities of Cordoba, Cairo, and Samarkand, whose alignments were similar to that of the Kaaba. That's it? A theory built on just 3 cities? These theories were only created after the 9th century, so much too late to explain what they were doing in the 7th and 8th century. So he's looking at the wrong century to even get this theory from. That doesn't help us with the 7th and 8th century when this supposedly sacred geography didn't even exist. There are no known records or writings about the sacred geography in the 7th and 8th century when these more accurate Qiblas were being erected. Thus, isn't this simply a later redaction and nothing more than a theory? The fact that the earlier Qiblas were more accurate suggests that the later medieval scholars either lost that knowledge or refused to repeat it. Theory number 5. They had different Qiblas because they were more or less due south or in Jordan and Syria. The mosque in Jordan and Syria all face due south, which is close to Mecca. Gibson says, of course, the mosque in Jordan and Syria face south, because both Petra and Mecca are south of these 2 countries. Yet when you look at the Qiblas and test Mecca against Petra, all of them are closer to Petra than Mecca. Furthermore, all the other mosques, which are not north or of these 2 cities, such as east and west, also face Petra and not Mecca. Theory number 6. They built due west in India and due east in North Africa. Gibson says either King hasn't looked carefully at Gibson's research or he purposely chooses to disregard it. The mosque in India, especially the one in Cheraman, the Juma Mosque in Kerala in 629, are facing directly towards Petra, not Mecca. All the mosques in North Africa are facing due south, paralleling a line between Petra and Mecca, and not east. So either King is just not aware of this, or he refuses to read Gibson's book. But obviously, he cannot support that because none of these are facing west or east, according to his theory. Theory 7, built more or less due north in Yemen and East Africa. Gibson once again says either King hasn't looked at Gibson's research or he purposely chooses to disregard it. Naturally, the mosques in Yemen and East Africa are facing north because both Petra and Mecca are north of these countries. The Grand Mosque in Sana'a, built in 705, is only 0.36 from Mecca, but 8.8 degrees from Mecca. So it is very much facing Petra and not Mecca. So that debunks King's theory right there. What's more, there are absolutely no early East African mosques discovered yet. So why is he even saying that? He has nothing to support it. And then King comes up with 6 mosques, and he tries to explain by using these 6 mosques that Gibson is completely wrong. He starts with the Umayyad Mosque in Damascus. He says that it faces Petra, but it was built on a Byzantine basilica, which replaced a Roman temple. And that's why the Syrians happily built a mosque facing the Syrian corner of the Kaaba. Gibson knows about the history of this mosque, but the Byzantines did not follow the designs of the Roman temple below it. They only used the rocks and debris from the Roman temple, nothing more. So either King did not know this history or he refuses to admit it. The Muslims, like the Byzantines, built this mosque at the same place as the Byzantine church because it was in the center of town, but they completely tore it down and built over top of it using the debris. And the mosque does not face Petra, but the between position, so it's not even the same direction as the Byzantine basilica. And it is the same with the other 20. So again, debunks that theory pretty quick. The Dome of the Rock. This is probably the most famous one, as we've been talking about before. And King says that it's facing south, so that could be Mecca. The problem, it's 12 degrees off from Mecca, and it's only 3.4 degrees from Petra. So it's obviously, it is much closer to Petra. It's even more close than the between mosques. So the Dome of the Rock and the Dome of the Chain and the Dome and the Al-Aqsa Mosque and the whole citadel are facing Petra. So certainly not Mecca. He then goes to the Canton Mosque, the Guangzhou Mosque, and he disputes that. He says he believes it was directed towards the summer solstice, which is 295 degrees, and it couldn't have been built in 627, which is before Muhammad had died. Gibbon, again, says, listen, this was not a mosque, it was a temple, it was a Nabatean temple to begin with. Tradition says it was built by an uncle of Muhammad in 630. It was rebuilt in 1350 and 1695. On page 134 of his book, he shows that there was much contact with the Arabs and the Chinese at this time, from 100 BC to 600 AD. So there is no reason to doubt previous contact with the Nabateans. John Hill, he points to John Hill, who writes about the Chinese Silk routes and mentions that the Chinese explorers visited the Middle East between 25 and 50 AD. He found that the Chinese had contact with the Nabateans specifically and took a group of them to China, where they could easily have explained their use of the stars that early. We are now only hearing about these contacts between the very early Arabs and the Chinese in just the last 4 or 5 years. Over 100 records of exchanges between the Chinese and the Romans are recorded as well. So it would have been easy for them to have incorporated the Nabatean technology for finding and directing using the stars. Again, debunking completely what King had said earlier. King then goes to the Sana'a Mosque there in Yemen, suggests that the major axis of the mosque is parallel to that of the Kaaba in Mecca. They wanted it to face the southeastern wall of the Kaaba, not Petra, which they knew nothing about. Gibson says that everyone had contact with Petra. Why is he saying that this was not known? Take a look at the maps that we showed earlier. It's a center of all the trade routes, so they all knew about Petra. What's more, it has a history going right back to the 2nd century BC. Where is there any literature, in other words, before medieval theories, which speak of using any walls of the Kaaba for directing early Qiblas? It just doesn't exist. This is nothing more than a theory that was created in the 9th, 10th, and 11th century. If they knew the direction of the Meccan Kaaba walls and were able to parallel the mosque so that direction was accurate, then why couldn't they have also directed their Qibla with equal accuracy directly towards Mecca? So you can't say that that's the reason they directed it, because then they would know exactly where that mosque was, and they could have therefore put their Qibla in that direction. The fact is they didn't direct their Qiblas to Mecca until after 727. It was not even a factor because there was no Mecca that early. He talks about the Cordoba Mosque in Andalusia, and he says that it's facing south and not towards Mecca, and this is his quote. He believes it was built to follow the Roman pattern with the minor axis solsticially aligned between the summer sunrise and the winter sunset. And it was built exactly in accordance with that suburban seat street plan. And that is why it faces a direction perpendicular to the solstice. Its major axis is parallel to the major axis of the Kaaba. And King uses Michael Bonin, who has found that these mosques in North Africa follow Roman plans of a city, which follow the cardinal directions. Gibson's response to that. The map at the right, just take a look at it and look at the red lines. They do not follow these directions. Note the differences between the older southern section and the newer, two completely different directions. If this Cordoba mosque follows Roman roads, then why do the other 8 North African mosques follow southern directions without equivalent Roman roads? This theory is maybe only possible for Cordoba, but not the other 8. He believes the North Africans decided to follow neither the Umayyad nor the Abbasid sanctuaries, but used a direction which gave credit to both, and only when the Abbasids finally took over, all the subsequent North African mosques aligned their Qiblas towards uniquely Mecca. Number 6, the last one, Wasit Mosque. King believes that it was built and then that was faced the winter sunset, which is parallel with the Meccan Kaaba northeast wall, chosen by early Iraqis and then redirected later using mathematical equations. And he says that this was mostly acceptable in those days, but doesn't quote anyone, he just says it. Gibson's response is, isn't it odd that they could build a Qibla in which was more or less parallel to the northeast wall of the Kaaba, but they could not find the Qibla, which actually was directed right at the Kaaba. And it was called the Between Mosque by Al-Hajjaj for a reason. Wasit means between, and this was his first mosque. Now we go into how his anger against anybody that disagrees. When you read this paper here, it is full of anger, full of vitriol. It is not very academic. It does not seem to have been written by a scholar. He says this, I never thought while preparing all my research that someday someone would come along and announce that all earlier mosques are oriented towards a location other than Mecca. No serious scholar, Muslim or non-Muslim, would ever have thought that mosques might have been deliberately oriented towards somewhere other than Mecca. If they had, they would rightly be considered deranged. This shows the danger of assuming Islam has its own history correct. Interestingly, only he, as a scholar, refused to consider any other possibility. Shouldn't a good scholar, always be open to peer review or other ideas or even reflections on his own views? How does he conclude that another view is deranged? Does it, using such vitriolic language, undermine his own argument? Employing ad hominem like that usually means one has no further ideas. He then goes on to say, especially against the revisionists. Some 50 years ago, some over-enthusiastic, I'm bolding that for a reason, London-based Arabists like John Wansborough and his student Michael Cook and Patricia Crone came up with the idea that Islam began not in Arabia, but somewhere unspecified in northwest Arabia. This was a curious idea, he says, not least because there was no obvious potential sites. One of the principal and most convincing arguments for their bold assertion was the fact that the earliest mosques in Egypt and Iraq do not face Mecca, but rather some locality in northwest Arabia. Note the words he uses in bold. What's fascinating, notice he calls these people over-enthusiastic, a curious idea, bold assertions, and that they are calling a fact. Now, does he know who he's talking about? Take a look at those names. Look at those people. Dr. John Wansborough, head of the Middle Eastern section of School of Oriental and African Study in the University of London, considered to be one of the greatest minds of his time in the 1970s and 1980s. Two of his students, Dr. Michael Cook, who now teaches as head of department at Princeton University in this very area. Dr. Patricia Crone, reads and writes 15 languages, has done the most germinal work and is the most dangerous in this area because of her ability to read the original documents. And he says that these are just over-enthusiastic London-based Arabists, and that their ideas are curious, or that they are using bold assertions to make views that are facts. Can you see? I would suggest that he be careful who he's talking about. King then goes and says, well, what about Gibson? He has no qualifications. What about Gibson's 25 years on the field, or his over 100 mosques he has personally studied, or the languages he knows? It's interesting to me that King, who only went to one mosque, suddenly he has all the qualifications because he did all his work in a library. Gibson left the library and actually went to every one of these mosques in person. Isn't that what any good researcher should do? And that's why I say, be careful, King. You're going to find that it's your qualifications, though you have a doctorate and he doesn't. Where did you get your doctorate, and why have you spent your whole career researching these Qiblas and not going to them to actually look and see where they were facing or why they were facing in those directions? King goes on and says he has no understanding of the fact that modern directions from one place to another cannot be used to investigate the reasons underlying the orientation of pre-modern architecture. Gibson only used modern directions to measure the pre-modern architecture. As simple as that. You always use what's the best material at hand to be able to support your own findings. King then says Gibson seems oblivious to the fact that there is a well-established discipline called archaeoastronomy and has no understanding of astronomical alignments. Gibson does understand them perfectly. He just doesn't think that they're pertinent for the 7th and 8th century. They are nothing more than theories from the 9th, 10th, and 11th century. Gibson doesn't know anything about mosque construction. What about the many books on mosque construction he has read, including all of Creswell's books on the subject? Isn't Gibson the first to list all the earliest mosques? King goes on and says Gibson has no control over any of the numerous medieval Arabic sources, legal or astronomical, folk astronomical, and mathematical geographical relating to the determination of the Qibla. Gibson has over 10,000 books in his library, all of them on these similar subjects. But King wouldn't know that because he didn't ask Gibson that to begin with. Gibson, he says, does not quote earlier medieval experts on the subject, so is not aware of their findings. Gibson knows them well, and he does quote them. But he doesn't use them because he doesn't agree with them because they're all much too late. And they start from the wrong presupposition. They're assuming that you can only use mathematics to find these Qiblas without realizing that the earlier Muslims used the stars. Gibson shouldn't have chosen Petra for his location of the early Kaaba because in Petra, in the early 7th century, there were no Arabs, no Muslims, no Jews, and in brief, there was not much going on. It's obvious that King does not know his history well. Gibson didn't choose Petra, it chose him. All the Nabatean kings were called Arabs. That whole area was called Arabia in the north. Petra was, he's thinking that a modern Arabia, which has only been around for about 400 years. Petra was at the center of the trading world from the 2nd century right up until the 8th century, or possibly King just didn't know that. But then he did not go and look at pre-Islamic Arabia, which was centered at Petra. Gibson's work all has contributed to dubious causes. What exactly is dubious about what Gibson is doing? Shouldn't every scholar want to be peer-reviewed, and shouldn't every scholar want to go with what the nearest and the best research and evidence is at hand? But more seriously, King goes on and says, Gibson's writings are guaranteed to contribute to Islamophobia against those who have no idea about the one and only civilization, which really took orientations seriously for about 1400 years. I would suggest that this is nothing more than xenophobia by King. Is researching Islam academically or critically a sign of Islamophobia? And is he not following into the same track that Muslims always throw against us? This is part of the scientific process. And this is why we need peer reviews. Hundreds of Muslims are writing Gibson now, thanking him for helping them. How can this be Islamophobic if Muslims are thanking him for it? So he doesn't just confront the Orientalists and Gibson. He has a final warning in his 52-page article. And he says this: in all such investigations, no conclusion should be drawn based on actual Qibla direction calculated from modern geographical data using some kind of exact mathematical procedures. Also, measurements and calculations to the nearest degree are adequate for investigative purposes. Or any attempt at greater accuracy is unrealistic. Here's my question. Why not use modern data and exact mathematical procedures? Don't they show us just how accurate the Petran and between mosque Qiblas really are? Why does he refuse modern mathematics when it is the 9th to 11th century mathematics which he employed for his earliest calculations, which were wrong? Why in the world, if he did that, and he was the whole reason why he used the 9th to 11th century scholars, is because they had more accurate mathematical equations, why is then he disputing it here? When we have even more and much better geographical data, especially accurate GPS location and the Astra satellites. The very thing that he supports his theories with is what Gibson has done, but he's used modern 21st century accuracy over 9th to 11th century inaccuracy. And then I would ask, why settle for nearest degree when you can get exact degrees instead? What is he fearful of? Well, I can tell you what he's fearful of. He's fearful of his own career. King only researched 3 to 5 mosques, while Gibson has researched over 100. King only used 1 to 2 examples for each of his theories, while Gibson looked at what the evidence showed and employed over 100 examples. King asked us not to use any exact data or modern methods to come to any conclusions, while Gibson employed more accurate data, proving King wrong. King basically wants us to throw out any data which may confront his conclusions. Yet King only quotes 9th to 11th century theories without employing any earlier 7th to 8th century writers or the evidence which Gibson found. Muslims are not accepting King's views, since he suggests the earliest Muslims used Roman and Byzantine ruins for their Qiblas, which is anathema to Muslims. All Muslims are to face the Masjid al-Haram, not the Kaaba. But there was a Masjid al-Haram already in Petra, and then a subsequent Masjid al-Haram in Mecca. King's ego has been hurt and his career may possibly be in tatters because of what Gibson has found, which may explain his over-the-top opprobrium towards those who disagree with him. Now, we need to end, so let me do my concluding remarks. What we have seen, the late 9th to 10th century traditions are no longer viable. They just are too late and too far away. There are 3 problems with the historicity of Mecca. Well, number 1, its geography is incorrect, the wrong place at the wrong time. Number 2, references to it are all either non-existent or incorrect. Look at the vegetation and especially the olive trees. If Mecca is wrong, that means the Qibla is equally wrong. Dan Gibson's explanation for the 4 Qibla directions are viable and convincing. Petra fits the geographical and the vegetation references well. Petra versus Mecca fits the political machinations in the late 7th to early 8th century. Petra could be a precursor to Mecca or even a previous Mecca itself. Petra also fits the historical written references as well as the stages of the Hajj. Dr. David King's criticism of Gibson are not supported by any viable evidence. And his 7 criteria and his 6 mosque examples for early Qiblas are not historically sound. I would say they're not even theoretically sound. If Gibson is correct, then Mecca is the wrong place at the wrong time, while Petra is the right place at the right time with the right historical support.